It's time to talk about functions. What are functions and why do we need them? Let's assume that you are doing some sequence of applications all together. You get two numbers from the user and you sum them up. You find if they are prime or not. You multiply them. And again, you do a lot of operations on these two. And you want to do these sets of operations over and over again, right? So you want to have a sets of functions and applications that you want to do multiple times. You want to do the same thing over and over. This is where exactly you need to define a function for that purpose. You cannot just repeat the code, copy and paste it all over the place. So basically, a function can be defined as a block of organized, reusable code that can be used to perform a single related action. Functions, for that matter, provide better modularity for your application and a high degree of code reuse. As you may already seen that, Python gives you a lot of built-in functions, and you have seen them. Functions like print, you have seen exit, and input. These are the functions that are built in for you so that you don't need to redefine them. But you can also create your own functions, and these are called user-defined functions. Here, we want to get more familiar with user-defined functions, how you define them, and what is the syntax to do so. So let's start by an example. Here, we want to write a function which takes a value as a parameter and return its factorial. Before doing so, we all know that 5 factorial is nothing but, like 5 multiplied by 4 multiplied by 3 by 2 and 1. Or in other words, n factorial is n multiplied by n minus 1 multiplied by n minus 2, all the integer all the way down to 3 and 2 and of course 1. This is the definition of factorial. How do you define functions? This is the syntax for defining a function. You use the keyword def, name of the function, this is the name that you choose, and the parameters that you want to pass to it. When you have, and then you have colon, and then you hit enter, it's like for or if that you have like this space in front. You write your code here, and you either return a value or not, and that's it. So then later on, you can call name of the function and 10. Let's just say that whatever you get, you would return 4. This is a very dummy function where it takes a value and just return 4. Okay, that's it. Let me just call this function. You see, it's gonna give me 4. That's the most basic and trivial function that you can define. It would take a value and it would return a value. It does nothing on the input value for now. We'll get to a more sophisticated one and define the factorial function. But for now, this is just the syntax on how you define a user-defined function. So let's go back to our factorial function. We want to define a function that would take one integer as input and return the factorial of that number. So as I shown here, if you have, let's say 5, if you put 5 as input, you are expecting the output to be 120, right? So you want 120 to be the output of your factorial. This is again like how you define it. You define the def. Keyword factorial is the name that you're choosing for our function. We are assuming that the return is a value which we call fact. You're expecting the 120 to be printed. So let's go back to coding our factorial function. Our problem definition states that we want to write a function that takes an integer number as an input parameter and return the factorial of that number. So we are going to set the name of our function as factorial, and the input parameter is n. The function is going to return
a variable which we are going to call fact, and our goal is to fill in here. And ultimately, when we call this function with factorial, and let's say 5 inside the parentheses, the factorial of 5 would be printed. So as you can see here, 5 factorial is nothing but 5 times 4 times 3 times 20, which is 120. We're expecting that when we run this line of code, 120 is printed. Now it's time to basically get into the business of writing this code here inside this function. Okay, so as you can see here, we want to loop through these values and multiply them all together, right? So we want to go from, for I in range of, you can skip 1 or keep 1, that doesn't matter, to n plus 1 first, because you know that if you go from 1 to n would be excluded, but you want n to be included, right? So basically what you would do is that you go from 1, in the range function, you would go from 1 to n plus 1. Then here, you would like to multiply I by some value, let's call them fact, and return the value into fact, right? So here's what fact is doing. Like basically, let me just put this code in place and then explain it. So what we are doing here is that basically, let's say we get one number, we multiply it, but we want to keep that going on and on and on, right? So you're multiplying 1, then 2, then 3, and you store the result here, right? So basically, that's what you're returning. You also have to initiate this factorial, because the first time it's going to multiply, it's looking for a value. So you initiate it with 1 because you're multiplying, so 1 doesn't hurt anything. You just have to have an initial value, and then you multiply 1, 2, 3, and then you keep it here. Let's just run this code for now and see. Yeah, so we get the result we wanted. So again, that's how we do it here. We multiply, we go from 1 to n plus 1, excluding n plus 1, and then you multiply each integer in this range by our storage value. This is called storage value, whatever you want to call it, which we would finally want to return. Also, people would use this notation instead. If you can do fact. These two are just doing the same thing. This is just telling you that it's just a notation for multiplying a value by I and then store it in itself. So what we have done so far is that we have defined a function. We call it factorial. It returns a factorial of a number. If you're not familiar with the factorial, just look at some math notes to understand what factorial is. Basically, it's nothing but what we have defined here, multiplying n by n minus 1 all the way down to 1. We are looping through 1 to n and multiplying each integer in that range by our fact number. We have to initiate the fact number by 1, and then ultimately we return the fact number. So if you come here and you would say factorial 3, it will return 6 for you. So the factorial of 3 is 6. Okay, that's about the factorial functions. We still have more things to talk about, and that's what is called function argument. While writing your own function definitions or using built-in functions in Python, we need to keep a few things in mind. First is the required positional argument. This means that if a parameter is defined in a function, like n here, it is compulsory to pass a value as an argument to the function, right? So in this previous example, remember we had factorial 3. If we go there and do something like this, we do factorial, but we don't pass anything, we're going to get an error, which is telling us one argument is missing. This is called positional argument, and for every positional argument, you need to pass a parameter or a value as an argument to the function, and that's compulsory. Second, let's take a look at the new example here. Let's define a function like this. Let's define this function func like this. Here you have two parameters. One of them is name and the other one is age.
the name is a required argument where you can observe. But as you can see, the age has a pre-assigned value of 35. So let's call this function, just do a normal function call. So I'm going to call this function by passing a name and the age as 25. The name is Jane, and well, as expected, it's just going to print the name and age. Let's just run this. We can see that the name is printed as Jane and age as 25. Let's do another function call where we can just do a function call like this. Here, in this second example, I'm just going to pass a name and don't pass the second argument. It's still going to run. It doesn't throw any error for me because that second argument has a pre-assigned or default value. Python let us declare certain parameters in a function definition as default. So as you can see here, it's going to print the name as the one I've passed, but because I haven't any second argument passed to this function, it's going to print the default value of age, which is 35. So few things to note here is that the order matters, and you can have default parameter arguments. Let's do a few more examples of this sort. I'm going to define a new function now where as follows. So in this function, we have three inputs. The first one is positional. The second and third one are default argument, meaning that there is a default value for the second and third argument in this function. The function, like before, is going to print name, age, and city if the inputs are there. In the function call I have here, a name is passed to the function, which is Jane. Age is skipped, and then I have city to set as Seattle. It should be noted here that because you want to skip the second argument, you need to mention that Seattle is the city, right? So you are saying that Seattle is a city. Let me just run this. So it's going to print name as Jane, age as the default value because it's a default argument and you haven't passed any new argument to that, and then city as Seattle. If you do by like something like this, let's just try this one to see what's happening. If you don't mention city like this and you call this, it's going to pass age as Seattle because the order matters, right? So the function is going to consider all of these values in the order it has received the value. So it's going to see the first one as name, the second one as age, and then there's no third one, so it's going to use the default one. So age is printed as Seattle, which is something you don't want. If you want to pass Seattle as the city and skip the age, then you have to mention the argument or parameter name here. Or of course, you can do something like this. If you have a specific age in mind, let's say 56, and there's no need to pass Seattle because then you have three inputs here and then you have three arguments, everything matches. So you see you have Jane, 56, and Seattle. So what we are trying to do here is just to define that the function can have positional arguments. These are the compulsory arguments. You have to pass them. There is no default value for them. And if they are not there, it's going to throw an error. The second thing we're talking about is that you can have default arguments. If you pass those to the function, it's going to replace the default value. Otherwise, if they're not passed, Python interpreter is going to use the default value. Lastly, Python provides another interesting feature for function. It's called a variable length argument. Let me define a function with variable length argument and tell you how it works. Here is how you define a variable length argument. This argument is generally denoted by star args, and this parameter can accept a dynamic number of arguments. These arguments are all stored in a single variable in a form of a tuple, right? So if I just call this function like this, I'm going to call this function with a variable length argument like this. So it's going to print args, and what I'm going to pass to this is that I'm going to pass 1, 3, ABC. It's going to print ABC for me. So as you can see here, without even defining how many variables that you're going to pass, you can just pack them in the variable length argument star args, and it can accept numerous number of arguments and store them in a tuple. So with that, we have covered the arguments in the function and introduced positional arguments, default arguments, and provided some examples so that you guys are familiar on how to use this for your user-defined functions, or if they are inbuilt functions for Python. Python provides a unique way to define a function in a single line using a lambda operator. This is very similar to the way we were doing list comprehension in a single line, as opposed to doing a big for loop with inters, break lines, and so on and so forth. Let's write a lambda function which takes a parameter and returns whether it's an even number or an odd. The syntax would be like f equal, we have the keyword lambda, followed by the name of the parameter and then colon. And then the implementation code is followed after the colon. So you have even if x %2 equals 0, else up. Right? This is how we write a single line lambda function with a simple if else. Since lambda functions do not have a name, they are also called anonymous functions. These functions can be stored in variables in the form of function objects. In this example, we are storing the function in a variable f, and since the variable f is holding a function object, it's become a callable object. So you can use it by having a parenthesis and giving an input like 10. So you can see here we have a callable object, which hence becomes a function where you can pass a variable or a parameter and get an input.